Hey guys, welcome back to The Knife Life. Last time we started a conversation with Master Bladesmith Steve Rollert about Damascus steel, how we make it, where it came from, and why we should particularly care about it. We didn't get the chance to finish that conversation last time, so if you haven't seen that first video, I would heartily recommend checking that out first. So without further ado, let's go ahead and finish up our conversation with Steve. So Damascus used to be extremely valuable back in the day because it had the superior qualities.
More valuable than gold.
Yeah, it was what would keep you alive in a fight.
The blacksmith who could make a sword, and it was closely guarded secrets at that time, you were one of the most prized craftsmen in the community by the kingdom because you could make weapons that were better than those of the tribes or nations around you, hopefully, and that would not break in warfare.
And this was because by laminating everything, you would have the softness of the iron that would absorb the shock of the impact, and you had the hard edge of the higher carbon steels would actually maintain the edge and keep it sharp.
And you'll see on old swords that have been excavated from dig sites and from the watery graves of battlefields that are now underwater, you'll see that they sometimes had as many as 12 different ribbons of steel treated in different fashions in different parts of the blade to compensate for high impact, for flexation, for length. All these things were taken into consideration. They became very analytical about the way they assembled their blades. And it's fascinating. This is a study that can take a lifetime. There are people that just study this stuff for their entire life.
There's an entire field called archaeometallurgy that's devoted specifically to that.
Absolutely. And we as bladesmiths learned from those archaeologists and the metallurgists that are researching those old blades to try to learn how some of those patterns were made, because they were making amazingly intricate patterns centuries ago. Amazing stuff. A lot of this is documented in Manfred Saxe's book, Damascus Steel, a very expensive book. Also,
pretty much the seminal book on Damascus steel,
in my opinion. And I would say that it was one of the chief learning steps, the big steps. It was one that took me to a completely different level in my craft. When I started seeing what was done in the ancient times, it gave me a target for where I needed to go, because there were things in that book represented I had never seen in any of the knife shows or any of the knife books that I had at the time.
So Damascus was really the top end during its heyday, back in the olden days. Today we've upgraded, well, we at the very least have the high-end carbon steels with significant alloying.
Yeah, specialty
so
alloy.
You'll end up with the crucible powdered metals.
Yes.
We're introducing vanadium, molybdenum, all sorts of different trace elements into the steel in order to alloy it and get to really high-performing steels. Does Damascus steel really hold up as well as it used to do in regards to these steels?
Damascus steel will behave, dependent upon what you make it out of, as well as the base metals that it's made out of. The high alloys, the S30Vs, the BG42s, and all those that you can name that are the super alloys that we're making knives out of, will outwear Damascus steel, but they won't out-collect Damascus steel. Because we as craftsmen, when we make Damascus steel, we're making something that contains our fingerprint, so to speak, and every time we touch that steel with a hammer or a chisel or a file, we change the appearance of the finished product. So no two blades are truly identical. Even though the shape can be identical, the pattern in the steel will be different because I may have hit a little harder or twisted a little further or done something different that day just because I was feeling more horsey.
So for the people who are looking for a high-performance blade, but they want to keep it in a little bit more of a budget region, the space-age steels are really more of the way to go if you're looking for a very high-performance knife.
Well, as an example, if I was to make a knife for the SEAL team, I would make it out of a steel that was designed for the specific environment that they're going into. Often salty or caustic environments. The steel will be exposed to all kinds of corrosives like salt water or chemicals and that sort of thing. So I'm going to use a steel that performs the best for them. If I have a collector, however, that wants a blade that is something you won't find on every store shelf. Then the Damascus steel, because it wears very, very well, but just not in all environments, I will make them a Damascus blade for the collectability and for the personality of the blade. Mm-hmm. Because the blade has, I hate to say it this way, it has more soul. It has more of me in it.
It has personality and character to it.
Yeah. I've actually had a customer ask me to fold some of my hair, which there's not much of. I'd pluck it from here. Fold some of my hair into the blade just because to him, having some part of me in that steel was something that was of great value to him. That hair just went, it wasn't in that steel for long. But there are a lot of mysteries around Damascus. The Vikings and how they quenched their swords, facing due north. And I've had people come and ask me to quench their sword in wine, facing north on a full moon at the winter or the summer solstice. There's things they want to have done. I'm glad to try it. It's fun. I learn things.
It makes for a good story.
And if you quench into alcohol, it's a real experience. But go ahead.
So one of the things that we talked about a little bit previously is flaws that will occur due to problems with the actual forging process. And you don't want to pick up a blade with one of those flaws in it. So can you tell us a little bit about what to look for
Absolutely.
In a Damascus blade? What to look for, what to avoid, and how to determine if this is actually a blade that you should actually invest in?
Well, that's an excellent question. And when you look at the pattern in the steel, and we'll have some images of such, you don't want to see a sudden crack-like line along a seam. You'll see sometimes a black line that's a cold shut or the opening to an inclusion. You look for it sometimes looks like a crack, sometimes it looks like a fissure, sometimes it looks like it's going to be like almost a blister. We've all had blistered on our hands when they get dry and you can see that the blister's about to peel off. Steel can show that. And it'll show as a little flap on a steel. And if a smith, this often happens with the blades that are so commonly coming in from Pakistan and Afghanistan right now. We don't know what steel they're starting with, and we don't know what they're forging in. Those blades so often have flaws in them, inclusions and cold shuts, that are going to fail down the line. We don't know how that steel's going to wear. I always tell people when they're looking at buying an heirloom quality blade, a Damascus blade of any sort, to contact the maker. Now that maker might be Boker Knives, but the Boker and other factories have a PR person that will answer your questions as a collector and say, well, what steels were used, how was it put together, this sort of thing. Do you use flux, do you not? And, the factories will do it in a vacuum furnace. They don't need flux. They have a vacuum furnace and they can isolate all their metal. But if you're a custom collector or a person collecting handmade knives, I always encourage my customers, all customers, to contact your knife maker and ask some questions. Ask him what steels he started with. How does he forge weld? You don't need to criticize or say, well, Steve says. Just ask him. He'll tell you honestly what he does. And it can help you make a good decision. If you have the opportunity to go and visit his shop, I would highly recommend going and visiting anyone's shop that you're thinking about buying a blade from and see what the environment is that they work in. You're going to learn about that person a lot more and the end product by seeing how they are in their happy home space. So you ask them for the steel. Do you want to have quality steels as your foundation? The heart of the knife is the steel that we start with. The soul of the knife is the hardening and tempering of the knife. And in Damascus steel, that we add the third item, which is the spirit of the knife, and that's what's displayed in the pattern that goes into it. Your customer's getting an irreplaceable part of your life when they buy your blade. We want them to get the very best piece of their life that they can get at the highest quality. I don't let a blade out of my shop that has even the smallest pinhole or flaw in it. If I find a flaw anywhere on the blade, it's scrapped. And those of you that are beginning knife makers and you have blades, it's so tempting to just sell it even with a flaw because you want to make the money back because you have money and time invested in that blade. Do not sell that knife. Put that knife away, alter it, get rid of that flaw, make a different shaped blade. But do not let something out that's flawed because it will reflect on your reputation later.
So the space age steels are very good for smaller blades, cut really well, but a lot of them aren't really well suited for larger blades with a lot of shock and impact.
Very true.
So Damascus is still a very good option when it's made with proper carbon steels for larger blades, such as big hacking bowie knives and large long swords.
You can make a really great blade out of Damascus combining different steels, and the Vikings were really good examples of this type of a technology where they made the core of a coarser grain Damascus that would offer a particular kind of resilience they were looking for, and then they edge wrapped the outside with the best steel that they had. Now you can do that in a couple, 2 or 3 ways, but the nice thing is about Damascus is we can assemble the billet to meet the desired effect that the customer has. The customer is desiring, say, a chopping blade. Even if I'm not using Damascus, I might choose to combine 2 or 3 different steels and assign my type of an application, and even perhaps forge weld into an inverted diamond the cutting edge so that I can have a super high impact cutting edge on a more flexible or durable body. We can combine those steels as smiths. We can fuse them together if they're compatible and make a fantastic blade that you'll never find on the market. But you're right, aerospace steels, like all steels, have limitations. And a knife that I carry personally on my clipped in my pocket will be of a different steel than a longer fighting knife I would make. But as far as Damascus steel holding an edge, it will hold an edge every bit as well as anything else that I find in factory knives of a similar size, because I heat treat, and any bladesmith can, heat treat to the intended end use. Remember that factories heat treat to the lowest common denominator. You may get a folding knife out of the most amazing new release steel, but the manufacturer knows that somebody's going to go and try to use that to pry open a crate, or they're going to throw it against a tree, and that steel may not endure that kind of treatment. If it's heat treated to its best cutting edge, it may not take flexation well. And that's the third thing that we as bladesmiths can make. We can harden and temper a blade differentially so that it has a very hard edge and a very springy or flexible back, depending upon the intended purpose of the blade. So we can tailor our heat treating to the end customer's use. We can hit it spot on, and our knives will outwear factory knives hands down all the time, because we're not worried about the guy throwing it against a tree. If he wants a throwing knife, we'll make him a throwing knife. But that's a nice thing of talking to our customers.
So this actually segues really well into another question that I see a lot of the time, which is, okay, I have these 2 different steels. How do I heat treat this? How do I determine what the heat treat is? Because I have 2 different possible heat treating routes. How do you determine how to actually perform the heat treat on a Damascus blade?
Well, we look at the steel that takes the quickest shock heat treating. So in the case of 1095 and 15N20, the 1095 is a water quenching steel that will take a quick thermal shock. The good thing is that if we know what steel we're starting with, we can look at both the alloy. As an example, as a sideline note, if it has a lot of tungsten in it, it's not going to want to forge weld well. It might make an excellent knife, but it's not going to make a good piece of Damascus, because the tungsten doesn't allow it to forge weld well in large volumes of tungsten. But we look at the steels, we find out, since I buy all my steel brand new, I know its origin. I'm not taking a leaf spring from here and a coil spring from there and a steering column from over here and whatever I find. And it's of an unknown origin. Maybe it was made overseas someplace in countries where they don't control their metallurgy as carefully. I don't know what I'm heat treating. Then I have to do a whole lot of tests. But if I start with a known steel from a known source, I can learn from them what their optimal heat treating profile is. But I always have to take into consideration, if I'm combining a water hardening steel with an oil hardening steel, water hardening steel will harden in oil. It just needs to be heated oil. But oil hardening steel may not like going into water. It might crack. So I'm going to heat treat to the gentler of the 2, and then I'm going to do some cut tests, and I will adjust how I'm heat treating according to what my cut and break tests are. People really sweat bullets when they think, I need to break a Damascus knife. I need to break a piece of Damascus to find out if my heat treating is correct. But it can be a ribbon of metal that's of smaller dimension, and I can break it and look at the crystalline structure and see where my finest crystalline structure is, and then I heat treat a whole ribbon of that to that same crystalline structure at that temperature in that quenching medium. Then I check which way do I temper it to get the most wear. It's a lot of research, but once I've got that, I can make a knife that I'll wear a lot of other blades simply because the heat treating and the metallurgy are cooperating nicely together.
So there isn't any one, this is the way that you do it. You have to actually sit down and play with it.
You have to learn what that steel has to teach you. And I do brake tests when I change manufacturers. If I buy a load of 15N20 from Home Steel, I know that steel because that's what I use. But if I buy it from a 15N20 from another manufacturer, I'm going to do some tests because there's parameters to fall within those categories. The metal can have certain amounts within a bracket of alloy, but not two factories do it the same. So what worked well for Home may not work well for Admiral or vice versa. So I have to learn what that steel is. I don't want to be lazy. I want to give my customers something that's going to last the rest of their life and maybe the lives of their kids.
So one of the things that people don't actually realize is that after you polish a blade, a Damascus blade, you actually don't really see the pattern at all. How do you actually get that pattern to come out and pop?
Magic.
Excellent.
Magic. It's wonderful. What we do is we acid etch, and there's several different acids that work very, very well. The two most common ones that most people have heard about are muriatic acid, which you can buy as a brick and concrete cleaner right at your favorite big box store that sells construction supplies. The other is ferric chloride, and ferric chloride is known as an etchant for circuit boards. It can be bought under the trade name of Archer's Etchant, but you can buy it in various concentrations as you can with other acids. But the ferric chloride etches a black type of an etch, gives a real dark color to the 1095. The muriatic acid tends to do a brighter etch. Now, you do what you like. And I like the muriatic acid, but I have ferric chloride in stock. When people ask for it, I'll ask them, what do you want this to look like? Do you like a bright etch or do you like a darker etch? So the muriatic acid gives a bright etch, the ferric chloride gives a dark etch. Now, different smiths do it different ways. Some guys will suspend their knife in there and leave it for 20, 30 minutes and then come back and rinse it. I was taught by a Master Bladesmith from the ABS called Wayne Goddard. And Wayne would do an interrupted etching process under the understanding that he had that you're developing oxides on the surface of the steel as you etch it. And if you allow it to etch in a long bath, it will etch and you'll see a nice pattern, but it starts cutting both surfaces evenly. So what Wayne taught me to do, regardless of the acid I use, ferric chloride or muriatic, or even just the instant coffee etch, which is a very dark etch as well, I etch it for 1 minute, my first etch, and I polish it to a 400 grit finish at least. The higher your polish, the brighter the pop on your etch will be. Your pattern will show more on the brighter polishes. So if you want to take it all the way to a mirror shine, by all means do so. But I would start at a 400 grit. I wouldn't etch anything coarser than that. 800 grit's fine. You can go up into the fine polishes and it gets better and better and better. But I etch for 1 minute in cold muriatic acid. Now this is going to come as a surprise because a lot of guys are taught to heat up their acid, and that's how I did it for years until another knife maker by the name of Emery Morgenstern. I want to make sure I say it correctly. Sorry, Emery. Emery had an architectural ironworker friend of his tell him to use some hydrogen peroxide mixed into his acid to make it cut more aggressively. I tried that somewhat reluctantly, and man, does it work beautifully.
Cuts aggressively.
And I don't have to heat up my acid and have the air with that fume that you definitely do not want to breathe. Working with acid, protective clothing, wear an apron, rubber gloves, safety glasses, and a face shield, please. Acid burns are no fun. But you have an acid bath, a tank of acid, a cylinder, a jar of acid. A piece of PVC pipe works really, really well, and the acid doesn't seem to bother it. Not the ones I use. And then you have another cylinder of, say, PVC pipe with baking soda water or trisodium phosphate, any real base.
Now, something to neutralize the
acid.
To
neutralize the acid. So I etch it in the acid and submerge it in the, and I'm mixing my muriatic acid with 3 parts of acid to 1 part of hydrogen peroxide is the mix I find to work very well for me. You can vary those mixtures to get different effects. That's what works for me. But I suspend it in the acid for 60 seconds. I bring it out, I dip it in the base, the soda water. That stops the acid's cutting. And then I go over to a buffer with a clean buff on it. I rake all the wax out of it, and I just run the buff across that steel to knock the oxides off that's caused by the eating of the steel by the acid. And I go back in and I'll etch it for 45 seconds, stop it, buff it, etch it, stop it, buff it. And I do them in 45-second intervals until I start noticing that my etch is starting to get real aggressive. And the more you've done this, I'm going to step back and tell you, when you buff those oxides off, the acid cuts a little bit differentially and will cut the 1095 a little more aggressively than the 15N20. By keeping those oxides off the surface, I get a more crisp etch to my steel. But when we're done, I generally do 10 to 12 cycles to get the pattern definition I prefer, and then I will immediately coat that blade so it won't rust because it's clean of all oils. And by the way, before you acid etch, wipe your blades clean with acetone or alcohol, wear gloves, to make sure there's no oil residue on your surface. And in between buffings, use a clean cloth to wipe off the buffing compound on your knife before you etch so that it doesn't have unequal cutting spots where you may have missed a little bit of wax from your buffing wheel or a fingerprint from your hand.
And one thing to take into account is that because you are actually etching the steel, you can actually feel the differences in the layers of the steel.
You'll run your fingernail across, and one of my defining factors is if you don't etch deep enough, that pattern will eventually wear down through use. So you want to etch deep enough to where you can feel with your fingernail when you run it down the blade a little bit of chatter as your fingernail goes down. The disadvantage of etching really deep is that then food juices or meat, things that you're cutting with your knife can get caught down in those little valleys. And if you don't cleanse that blade thoroughly after use, you can create spots for corrosion to start. And so people ask me, how do I protect my Damascus blade from rust and corrosion? It will patina with age, which I like. It gets a real nice, almost a sky blue color in there from patinaing by use. But to protect my blades, I use Renaissance wax. I clean the blade thoroughly and I rub on a thin coat of Renaissance wax and then let it cure only for a moment. And then I buff it with a soft cloth. I don't put it on the power buffer. I rub it with a soft cotton cloth.
All right, so for the people who want to learn more about Damascus, do you have any recommendations on additional sources that they can go look at?
Well, I would say the best book out there would be Damascus Steel by Manfred Sachse if they want a historical view from almost all the continents. It's the most complete treatise of Damascus steel I have ever seen. I would recommend that people get that book from the library. It may be available as an ebook, I don't know, but it's probably the best resource that I know of for that particular subject. That's where I'd send everybody. But there are also books by Jim Harasulis, the Master Bladesmith and the Complete Bladesmith. Some of his information in there is a little bit dated just because he wrote it a long time ago and some of the things have changed. But it's a good tutorial. And there's some excellent YouTube videos. But folks, I'd like you to think about this. There's no qualifications required to place a YouTube video. So choose your masters carefully. Choose somebody that you really think is going to teach you something. Look at their work. Look at their reputation. Do a little research and figure out who you want to study under. There's a couple of guys that I highly recommend. Murray Carter is a Japanese kitchen knife maker, has a fabulous YouTube channel covering the approach of Japanese forging of kitchen knives, and he is a good instructor on all levels of what he shows. The second one is Walter Sorrells. Walter has a very good tutorial and educational YouTube channel I recommend. And of course, Mr. James Allen is doing a good job of educating people on amazing breadth of different information. So I would recommend looking at those people. Alec Steele is another gentleman who does a lot of demonstration type stuff. He's not so much teaching as he is just showing how to do some amazing things. But I would start with those resources. But the book, definitely Manfred Saxe, Damascus Steel.
Excellent. I will have links provided to those books down in the description below. So thanks again, Steve.
Thank you, James.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Knife Life. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so I can get more content like this out to you guys. Until next time, stay safe and keep living the knife life.